Radio Retro Future.
Good day everyone, I'm Bonsard of Radio Retro Future, and for those who have watched my channel before might know, I'm a big fan of high concept stories. For that reason, I want to talk a little bit about what current day writers get wrong about high concept, and in particular how it is being communicated on platforms like BookTube. So I recently have this experience where a friend of mine, a successful author, is trying to write a story for the Association of Ishtar. Now I'm still trying to figure out how to best communicate how people can submit their ideas to the stories, and for that reason I created a kind of a two-step plan. And the first step is to write a blurb of 150 words and no more. Now there's multiple reasons for this. One of them is that 150 words is about a YouTube short, 1 minute, and the other is so I can see if the author understands the concept, or rather how high concept is written, and that right there is one of the biggest issues these days, that very few people even understand what high concept really entails. Now when I was young, we had two flavors of science fiction, which was either Star Wars or Star Trek. Star Wars being what we now call science fiction fantasy, and Star Trek, which we call general science fiction. And the big difference is, and why you cannot conflate science fiction with fantasy, is that Star Wars is low concept. It literally is the theory of Campbell, the hero's journey, applied to a science fiction setting, essentially. But in the end, it's just fantasy in space. And the other is Star Trek, which is high concept, which is, well, science fiction, which is speculative fiction. You kind of think of what would happen if humanity goes where no man has gone before. That's literally the tagline of the series. So you speculate about other worlds and what our interactions with alien species would be. Nuances aside, when you are of my age, we basically had people who enjoyed Trek or people who enjoyed Star Wars. And I just explained why that is. And nowadays, we have more flavors of science fiction. We now have Stargate, we have Babylon 5, a series like that, and they all kind of follow a very similar formula. And that is that humanity encounters a situation which involves alien species. There is a conflict, they resolve the conflict using pseudoscience, etc. And Star Trek did this pretty well up until, well, Voyager. Deep Space Nine was one of my favorite Star Treks, and one of the reasons was that it was heavily inspired by Western, and I'm gonna touch on that a little later. Voyager, on the other hand, had a lot of people who were, the premise was good, right? It did kind of something similar as Deep Space Nine, Deep Space Nine being like about a frontier station on the untamed borders of the Federation, and Voyager basically took that similar idea and then took it into a whole new era where there was no Federation at all. For both high concept and both low concept, this should have been a golden opportunity to try and do new things with Star Trek. And they failed in all regards. Not only did many of the authors not understand the basic essential things about science, like they did not understand how evolution works or what that was, it also failed on a low concept base that there was no progression. But now Star Trek is turning into basically Star Wars. Star Trek, with especially Discovery, started to try and emulate, well, Star Wars. It's no longer high concept. It is literally fantasy in space. It just looks all science fiction-y. That's about it. We can say something similar about Mass Effect, where it's basically just a hero's journey in space. However, they implemented a lot of science fiction concepts that makes it both interesting to people like me and people who are more interested in low concept. I mean, you can combine them, that just needs an understanding of how, well, it needs a good mastery of the craft. This is why, for writers like myself, things like Mass Effect are actually pretty interesting, because you are trying to put the characters in different situations, high concept situations where strange alien things are being explored, and then you have this overarching hero's journey that kind of connects the dots between all those particular situations. In Discovery, they failed to do that. And the same goes for Picard. I just don't like them for that reason, and I also hated the characters, but that's beside the point. But what do modern writers get wrong about high concept? And why is high concept so neglected in the theoretical, in the discussion space? And, well, one of the reasons is that high concept is poorly understood. There are plenty of people who write high concept, but they don't really understand why. And this is also comes back to my point that genre writing is actually an organic process where you kind of grow into until you find your niche. And I don't like writing low concept stories from the very get-go, and therefore I developed into high concept and I explored it in my videos. But why is it that so few people talk about actual high concept? And one of the reasons is that good high concept is pretty hard to write. And I remember listening to one podcast where authors talk about writing high concept short stories, where they say, well, you know, you've got your single idea, and then, you know, the whole story revolves around that idea, and then you get some conclusion that kind of reveals your thoughts on it. I read a lot of high concept stuff like that, where the writer has like one idea, and it all leads to that one idea, and, you know, and you see the result, and you're like, you know, it's like, oh, this is what you were building up to, some type of revelation of stuff that I either don't care about or already knew. So yeah, that's definitely an issue but that's a lack of mastery of the craft than down to the high concept thing itself. I mean, I think the Wachowski brothers, I love the first Matrix film. I think that is high concept done very right. However, then you realize that the reason why it went right is that they imitated Ghost in the Shell in a lot of scenes and a lot of style things and elements like that. And yeah, then they kind of started doing their own thing, and well, then you get like the other Matrix movies. And I recently tried watching another series done by them called, what was it, Sense8? I hated it. I thought that was, yeah, a very typical Wachowski product, so to speak. Yeah, this is a problem with a lot of high concept artists, where they get really enamored with their own ideas and concepts and the kinds of philosophies they want to explore. And yeah, Sense8 was not for me. How to write, and therefore how to write a short story for the Association of Ishtar, which I'm trying to encourage. And if you are interested in creating a shared universe that people can explore ideas that you introduce, please check out my other videos. And we also have, I am writing a manual in this. And again, this video is kind of like a step in doing that process. And I got this submission by a friend of mine that I mentioned before. And well, I mean, the moment he emailed me about this, I knew this was not gonna turn out as I wanted it to, because he was talking about this character, and this character could do things, and I was like, yeah, but that's not how you write high concept. High concept is about situations. It's the what if thing, and what if can be asked in the broadest sense of the word. And in particular with Star Trek, for example, you know, what if we find this particular alien species and they have this type of culture? You know, what if we encounter an alien species that's, you know, led by an alien god? What if we encounter a society that's led by an all-powerful AI? And so on, so on. Many science fiction films can literally be summarized to that. And that's where most people stop explaining high concept. You know, high concept is just, you know, you've got a premise where the story can be summarized in what if this happens. And with steampunk in particular, the emphasis on what if we have an alternate history where, I don't know, the French Empire developed a nuclear bomb, for example, right? Where you have the emphasis on, it's not if Napoleon won the war, it's what if Napoleon invented nuclear bombs. So you really tweak that question in the direction of the effects of technological innovation on the timeline. So you gotta be specific, you gotta be very clear in what you want to explore, and that is an art that is lost, I think. I mean, much of the science fiction that I see is really low concept, disguising itself as science fiction. And a good example of this would be Mortal Engines. Mortal Engines is a perfect example of a fantasy story pretending to be a interesting exploration of, you know, society of moving cities. And well, it's not. It doesn't go into enough detail to fully to make it an explorable world. So, but you know, a lot of people like it. That's probably because it is actually low concept. That's the big difference between a series like the Association of Ishtar and, well, in this case, Star Wars. Star Wars tried to turn itself into a high concept setting. In some regards it worked, but in the end it's just fantasy in space, which, well, I mean, we've seen the new Star Wars series, so, you know, there's very little you can actually do with it. And I think that Red Letter Media was right when they said that George Lucas does not understand his own creation, and that the world of Star Wars feels really, really small because there is such a big emphasis on the characters. And this works if you have a single trilogy, like, you know, the original Star Wars, like episode, what is it, officially it's now, what, 4, 5, and 6? It works in that context, but it doesn't work when you want to make an extended universe, because it's all about, the original story is all about Luke growing into the Jedi Master that can overthrow the Emperor, and then you also have the Darth Vader redemption arc, and it's, you know, where the son and the father join in the battle against the Emperor. So there's a lot of low concept highlights there, and it's done well and good. But when you try to expand that, because everything is revolved around the character development of Luke and Darth Vader, yeah, it doesn't work anymore. It starts to falter, starts to tear at the seams, and the writers working on Star Trek did not know how to handle that. George Lucas did not understand that. So how do you do high concept? Why is it so difficult? Well, when I grew up, I'm gonna go back into a while, we had a very popular TV show. I think it's still popular. I think they even remade it at some point, called X-Files. Now, and what you gotta understand about X-Files, it was basically about a FBI agent investigating potential alien activity, paranormal activity, strange and alien things and mutants and all that stuff. You know, things that is not supposed to exist. And, you know, but it's not about the main character per se. Sure, there is the low concept arc of, you know, Mulder and Scully, the two main characters. But in the end, it was really about the monsters. It was about the anomalies and how those two particular people reacted to it. You've got Mulder, who's like the believer. He wants to believe all this stuff is true. And then you've got Scully, who's the skeptic and, well, believes things, but also doesn't believe things. And first of all, she's very skeptical, but as the series progresses and moves on and on, she starts to become a little bit of a believer, but remains to have that skeptical edge that is required for the concept to be fully explored. Because if you have two characters who immediately believe everything, there is nothing interesting about it. And there's also moments that Mulder believes that he is really wrong, that nothing that what happened actually happened. Or there's also this one episode where Scully starts to believe things are true, and it is Mulder saying to her, no, that wasn't like that. And that is interesting. That is where we have like this high concepts of, you know, the skeptic versus the believer, and, you know, those interactions and how they react to paranormal situations. And you could, like, stretch that on, because as long as you came up with good, interesting monsters and didn't draw out the low-concept stories long enough, I mean, you could, basically, because it wasn't about the characters, you know, resolving, you know, the big final boss. It was about the monsters and the mysteries and, you know, the horror. And some episodes were a bit more funny, and others were a lot more horrific. So you could do a lot of different things. You could have comedy episodes, you could have horror episodes, you could have like mystery episodes, and you could have like evil monsters, you could have tragic monsters. And it was all about how people reacted to those situations. It wasn't about, you know, the grand plot. You know, you could have made 10 seasons of X-Files, and if written well, and if you kept up coming with interesting ideas, you could have stretched it out as long as you have. Which brings us to another strange realization that I made the other day, which is an anime called One Piece. Now, for those who are not familiar with anime, or One Piece in this particular case, it's a show that has over hundreds and hundreds of episodes. Yes, it can be done, but how do you do that? Well, first of all, there's all these overdrawn fights and stuff like that, and a lot of cutting with animation, and, you know, what a lot of animes like that do, where they have, like, characters screaming a lot, you know, in a kind of like freeze frame to save on animation, but, you know, it takes up time, so, yeah. So there's a lot of that. However, what is the situation in One Piece is also because it's written as a kind of high concept. It's something more interesting, but I'll touch upon that. What happens is that it is about a young boy who becomes a man who wants to become the Pirate King. So he becomes a pirate, he gets a boat, he has a crew of interesting characters, and they go from island to island on their way to finding a big treasure that will make him the Pirate King. And every island has like a problem, like there's a village and it's being threatened by some bandit or by some pirate or a corrupt marine official, etc, etc. And you have like all these interesting characters they meet. Some come back later in the series, others do not. But it keeps on going, because they go from island to island, they encounter new enemies, new villains, yada yada yada, and every time the main character grows stronger, it gets new abilities, yada yada yada. There's more to it, but I'm gonna leave it at that. When you think about it, a stranger who's very powerful comes into a strange town where there is a problem with bandits or some other threat. That's Western! One Piece isn't a pirate show, it's a Western show in pirate rags. And this is very interesting about a lot of old shows that I'm currently watching a lot of Western. I'm also currently watching Non-Jimbo, and they all have the same thing. There is a village, it has a problem, then a stranger comes in and resolves the issue one way or the other. And what's interesting about it, and the X-Files does this as well, is that the main characters, you know, the Clint Eastwood or Bronson type characters, don't really change. They don't really have the hero's journey as we see often propagated on places like BookTube. Instead, they are very good gunslingers or some other form of heroic archetype. They confront the bad guys in their own particular way, win, and then they ride off into the sunset. However, the villagers of many of these cities, they do change. You know, for example, Majestic 7, which is based on the Seven Samurai, which again is based on other westerns, funny how that circle goes, is about 7 strangers going into town. Now, in case of the Majestic 7, it's probably a bad example, but I'll use another film that I recently watched, which is The Dark Valley, which is an Austrian western taking place in 19th century Austria. And it's about a dark valley where the people are being oppressed by this particular family. And yeah, the main bad guy, so to speak, an elderly gentleman, like has his way with many of the women in that valley on their wedding night. So yeah, there is a lot of, well, children from that man in that same valley. But one day, a stranger from America comes into the valley and starts making friends with some of the families there. And it is an amazing film, it really is. But the character isn't really undergoing any form of character development. He's there to take revenge, and, well, we see how far he goes. It's actually going too far, probably, but he doesn't really learn anything. He doesn't really develop. We just watch how he takes on, how he drives his enemies mad with fear because, well, he's there to kill him, and he's very good at it. So it's an almost Predator-esque situation, something that's also very common in westerns. I watched Chapo's Land, which is a Charles Bronson movie where he plays a native Indian who gets accused of murdering a sheriff, which he did in self-defense, and as a result, a posse starts chasing him through, well, the deserts. And what starts as a manhunt on this, well, not really innocent Indian, but regardless, turns into an almost Predator-esque situation in which the posse gets killed off one by one by this Cree character played by Charles Bronson. Just that. The whole party, you see how the bad guys become insane with fear. You've got those who just want to kill him and don't care about anything else. They don't care about justice. There are those who wanted to see justice done, but, you know, are like, it's not worth it. And the group falls apart, breaks apart. They are terrified with fear, and by the end, there's just one guy left, and we see him how he runs terrified off into the desert, while Charles Bronson follows him from a short distance all the while. The Charles Bronson character doesn't really develop. It becomes personal when this particular posse find his family and have this way with his wife. But that's about it. He just becomes, it for him, what starts off as a attempt to get away for a crime he didn't commit, turns into him becoming the predator and they the prey. Or apart from that, he doesn't really change. There's a little character development to him, but we see how everyone else reacts to that. And that is where the power of the film lies. It's just this group of men turning on each other because of the presence of Charles Bronson. And let's face it, you'd be terrified too if Charles Bronson was chasing you. And that's the difference. When it comes to the association of Ishtar in particular, and what I do in my stories, it's not about the characters per se. It's about the monsters and how people react to them. And this is what I mean with high concept. It's a situation. People are either in a comical situation, they're in a horror situation, they are in another form of life-threatening situation, like a man lost in the wilderness and he only has an axe to get away. But, you know, the idea of the man against the wilderness, the man against the monster, the man against, you know, the bureaucracy of, I don't know, the National Health Service. All that stuff. That is high concept. And, you know, that's the problem. So you don't start, when you write high concept or you want to make a high concept story, you don't really start with the characters. You start with what is the situation. And then what happens? What is the thing that disturbs that situation? And a lot of westerns is you've got a town that's being threatened by some form of gang or cattle thieves and something like that. It's terrifying the local populace. But then the stranger comes in, and the stranger then uses the weaknesses of these gangs against it. And the strangers often do not change. They come, resolve the problem, and go. And that's because essentially their path to becoming a hero has already been resolved by the end that the story starts. So for them to undergo real change isn't necessary. We want some guy to come in and kick ass off these obvious bad guys. They are the concept, and how they react to that heroic character, that is what makes good Western, that is what makes good horror, etc. You know, why Alien is such an effective film is because we first are introduced to the crew and we learn who they are, but then all of a sudden they get confronted with this horrific alien, and we have this mystery, like, what is this alien doing? How are they reacting to it? It's not so much about the characters as it is about the situation they're in and how they react to it. Sure, they have like a character motivation. Sure, we say that the alien is the main character of the film, but really it's about the characters, you know, reacting to that. You know, a good man turns bad because, you know, let's say there is this noble husband, you know, and you know, he's this... Well, Charles Bronson's character in Death Wish is a great example of this, you know, where he's kind of like portrayed as this, well, let's call it a liberal character, you know, he has no affiliation with guns, you know, he believes in the goodness of humankind, then this horrible thing happens to his family and he becomes this vigilante who goes out and murder people. And, of course, it's not so much about Charles Bronson. Sure, we see everything through his perspective, but it is, you know, we want to see the bad guys being afraid of him. We want to see the bad guys suffer at his hands. We want to see that, you know, them being powerlessness in the awesomeness that is Charles Bronson. And that's the reason why I think characters like the Clint Eastwood characters, the Charles Bronson characters, the, you know, the Rambos, you know, when you see somebody like Arnold Schwarzenegger on screen, you know, bitch is gonna be screaming for mercy. You know, the same with Charles Bronson. You know he's gonna be kicking ass, and we don't really have that type of characters anymore. Like every actor these days is really created from, well, they just don't have that presence. I mean, we do have some indie movies that have characters like that, but they're indies movies. You know, when you see that same character on screen, you're not like, oh, you know, oh, now people are gonna suffer. We don't have those action heroes anymore. I mean, Downey Jr., you know, I love his acting. I enjoy most of the films he's in. But, you know, you're not gonna see him appear on screen and now, oh my god, now it's gonna happen. You know, we don't have those type of actors anymore, apart from, well, you know, elderly Arnold Schwarzenegger. It doesn't work anymore, does it? I mean, Arnold Schwarzenegger would work great in a Western. That I would want to see. You know, I mean, that's kind of like the power of films like, oh, The Expendables, you know, you all of a sudden have like all these powerful action stars on screen, like, now it's gonna happen. Yeah, we don't have those anymore. They were, in some regards, a creation of the 90s and the 80s, that followed in the wake. I mean, oh, there's this new Death Wish film with, the guy who was also in Die Hard, I forgot his name. But, you know, he could pull that off. And he could also pull up that vulnerability a little bit of the modern day character. And then turn into this vigilante. By the end of that, I think those characters would be... We need to bring back those characters, those type of actors who can pull that off. And wouldn't it be great if Boba Fett was played by some type of Sylvester Stallone? Yeah, you'd probably watch Sylvester Stallone as Boba Fett. Don't lie, you'd watch that. I hope that's at least clarified a little bit about high concept writing, why I love it so much, and why it is so hard to distinguish. Maybe I'll make a more formal, better produced video on it. Yeah, and I'm also writing my associates as... I barely talked about what I actually wanted to talk about, which was the Association of Ishtar. But I guess using X-Files and all that stuff is more relatable to you guys. But if you enjoy things like Stargate, X-Files, please check out my series, The Association of Ishtar. My newest story is kind of like a western set in the Netherlands, in an alternate timeline, but that's I intend to send that to Iron Age magazine, so you have to read it there if it gets approved. Johan also already made illustrations for it. And if you want to check out my short stories, I now have a new website on REAMstories.com where you can check out my short stories for free without even making an account. But if you want to read more, you're going to have to. And I also have all my books on there. So if you support the show, not only will you help me make more art so I can actually start making more narrative videos, which I want to do for a very long time. I just don't have the art. I just cannot afford it at this time. But that's what I really want to do. More art, more animation, more shows. And yeah, we've got a lot of other interesting stuff planned, like an RPG. So yeah, if you want to support all that, please check me out on REAM Stories and start reading today. And with that, folks, I'm gonna bid you adieu, and as always, make things your way. Good night.